So welcome to each one of you. And we are so appreciative of your presence here at Gems from the Wisdom Traditions, a conversation circle. We are taking up a topic today that may sound a little somber: preparation for death. And I think it's actually going to probably be a topic as we listen that has a lot to do with how we live life. I guess one thing that I could tell you about our speaker today is that this is a topic that he has been asked to speak on actually several previous occasions, just voluntarily, without him necessarily selecting himself. He was asked to speak on this topic on several occasions. And so this time, when the topic came around in our Gems circle, or a similar topic, Cliff volunteered for it. And so I'm very appreciative of that fact, as it is a topic that, as I say, is a little more somber, and it requires a deep reflection to look at this from a perspective that is going to give us a purpose, a bright outlook for our future as we are speaking of death. And Cliff is someone who I think is always able to maintain a bright outlook. And as my life partner, I've seen him go through many, many times, many different kinds of circumstances, and he always has a bright outlook. So I give you Cliff Tillotson on preparation for death.
Well, thank you guys for coming. I want to pat all of us on the back for taking the subject up. It feels a little bit like going to the dentist for a root canal sometimes. I thought I'd start by just sharing a little story about our grandkids. Our oldest grandson, Ryder, he's a little over 3 years old, and he has a fear of anything that makes a loud noise. And like helicopters, which we have right now going by, or trucks, or vacuums, or even sprinklers. But the good thing about this fear is you can have a rational conversation with him about it. And after that rational conversation, once he knows the source of his fear, he's able to control it and get rid of it. So that the other night we were having dinner and the sprinklers came on and he goes, oh, no. And we said, well, don't you want the plants to have something to drink? They're very thirsty after a hot day. And he goes, oh, okay. And the fear went away. Our granddaughter, who's a little over 1, is fearless. You can throw her super high in the sky and she loves it, or take her on wild rides and she loves it. But apparently, according to her mother recently, she's developed a fear of her own shadow, which is unfortunate. Hopefully she'll get over that fear, because that's something that seems to stay with us our whole life. It's always there, it's ubiquitous, it's always in the background, and you never know when it's quite going to show up. We thought that's a kind of a good analogy for death. It's kind of like always there, but usually in the background. I've been thinking, though, that with this COVID virus, in some ways, it's come out of the background. We've kind of tried in the modern secular world to kind of push it into a closet and lock the door. But COVID seems to have ripped the door off its hinges, and now we're having to deal with it. The uncertainty and the anxiety that surrounds death. I read the New York Times on my phone, and I see people all around the world wearing masks in all these different cultures, and I wonder, what they are thinking about behind those masks all the time now with this new world that we're living in. I know dentists are having more cases of people grinding their teeth, and psychologists and therapists are having a lot more stress-induced cases because of the current times we're living in. So in some ways, it's a actually a very apropos time to take up this subject. And I thought I'd look at it from the point of view of the ancient Greek philosophers briefly. There's that saying that the classical is contemporary in every epoch. So even though we're talking about individuals over 2,000 years ago, some of their ideas are pretty relevant. There was a talk recently on the GEMS about Pythagoras, who is kind of considered the father of Western philosophy. He lived 600 years BC, and he actually coined the term philosophy, which means lover of wisdom. Philo, love, and Sophia means wisdom. In that talk that Jim Tepper gave, he pointed out one thing that I think is relevant for a preparation of death. Pythagoras advised his students to always review their day before they went to sleep. And this review of the day, you look back on your day and you take into account all the good things you did and all the times you screwed up and so forth. But it's said that people that have actually died, lost their vital signs, and have been gone from the body for a while, and then they somehow come back into their body, they almost all universally say that when they did actually die, they saw their entire life come before them, all their major events, all their choices. It was like a giant review that we have at the moment of death. So reviewing one's day is like, in a way, practicing for the great job review that we're going to have at the end of our lives. 200 years after Pythagoras was the time of Socrates and Plato, and probably you remember from world history that you took, Socrates was condemned to death, sentenced to death for two things. One was honoring gods other than those that were allowed by the Greek polis of Athens. And the god that he honored was the god within himself, what he called his daimon. But that wasn't a state god. And then the other thing was he was corrupting the minds of the youth by helping them to become free thinkers and question authorities, which those in power really did not like at that time. They still don't like it today, it seems. And in the dialogue, the Phaedo, where he's just about to take the hemlock, which he's going to die from, and his disciples are around him, he's very composed, he's very relaxed, he's joking, and he says in that dialogue that all of philosophy really is a preparation for death. And then at the end of that dialogue, he drinks the hemlock. Prior to that, he has his trial called the Apology, and in the Apology, he makes a statement that the unexamined life is not worth living. And when he talks about life, he means the whole of life, which includes death. So if we don't think about death and try to in some way prepare for it, in some ways, it's the life we're living is not worth it, or we're not really actually living to the extent that we really should be as self-conscious human beings. About 400 years later, there was a revival of Platonism called Neo-platonism, and the beginner of that revival movement was Plotinus. And he has a really wonderful statement that he makes about preparation for death for a philosopher in particular. And the Greeks, they believe that the soul of man is twofold, that we have one side of our soul, which is more about the passionate side of it. And then the other side of it is more impersonal, universal, more spiritual. And that these two sides of our soul often kind of conflict with one another. Plato talks about them as being the dark horse and the white horse. But it's the job or the task of a philosopher to control that dark horse and encourage the white horse to take us on our journey into the higher realms. So the statement that Plotinus gives is this: the soul is bound to the body by a conversion to the corporeal passions. and is again liberated by becoming impassive to the body. That which the soul binds, nature, that which nature binds, nature also dissolves. And that which the soul binds, the soul likewise dissolves. Nature indeed bound the body to the soul, but the soul binds herself to the body. Nature therefore liberates the body from the soul, but the soul must liberate herself from the body. Hence there is a twofold death. The one indeed universally known, in which the body is liberated from the soul, but the other peculiar to philosophers, lovers of wisdom, in which the soul liberates herself from the body, nor does the one entirely follow the other. I've always found that to be a very intriguing quote. So with those ideas in mind from the Greek philosophers, maybe we can just ask ourselves, what are there any facts that we actually know about death? I think fact number one is that we all know that we are going to die as a mortal being. That's a fact. But we often like to not avoid that fact. The other fact, and I think this is an important one to bring up too, is that we don't really know what the afterlife is. There might be some that have inklings of it, but no one, I think, really probably has the full picture. There may be some enlightened beings that have a very, very good picture, but for the most of us, we don't have a clue. And that's important to know, I think, to keep that in mind, so no one tries to bamboozle us into thinking they know. Most likely, they don't. And then once we become aware that we are living in mortal forms, that we are mortal in our physical nature, and that we are going to die, I think we're compelled to develop theories or belief structures about death. I just think we have to do it. It's kind of like a sailor at sea looking for trying to see land. When he's out at sea, trying to look out past the horizon to see land. It's just natural. So we all have some belief structures about death. And I thought there's an analogy that one could make about humanity and its belief structures, which is using the sea analogy, that we all say are creatures that live under the sea. We're all sea creatures. And the surface of the ocean is kind of the line between us in the realm of the formed existence, and that above the surface of the ocean might be the formless realms. So of the creatures on the sea, there's some of us human beings that are really a lot like jellyfish. We just kind of float around. We don't really think about things much at all. We're moved by the currents, that psychic and the social and political currents, and we sway around, and we're easily manipulated. We don't give it much thought. We don't think about death. We don't think about life. We just kind of live in a realm of imagining. Then there's those that are kind of more like in the mollusk category, that like mussels and clams and oysters, that have a belief, but they cling to it so hard, they're actually grabbing like onto a rock at the bottom of the sea. And they refuse to think of anything else, but that's it. There's absolute certainty. Then there are these shellfish that run around on the floor of the ocean who believe their beliefs to be truth, and they go around and more or less proselytize their beliefs to everyone else with their big pinchers and stuff like lobsters and crabs. But most of us are like fish. We have belief structures. We need belief structures in order to survive, to move in the world. But we swim around, we hold our belief structures lightly, and we respect the belief structures of everyone else. That's, I think, the bulk of humanity. There may, every once in a while, we may, as a fish, get close enough to the surface, and like the flying fish, or what we call the malolo here in Hawaii, we actually have a deep insight or intuition or epiphany, and we can maybe even break through the surface for a little while, enter the realm of the timeless, formless realm, have some glimmer of it, but then we're back in the water again. I think there is also another class of human beings that you might call seers and sages, enlightened beings, who are a lot like the frigate bird or the Eva bird here in Hawaii that just hovers around mysteriously above the water. And they have these amazing eyes, which are naturally ultraviolet. And they have able to have both a universal vision as well as a piercing focused laser beam vision, such that they can swoop down out of the sky and grab one of these mololos, these flying fish, out of the air. That's partly because of their great vision. So anyways, that's an analogy that I thought about. But why don't we examine some belief structures that we have? This is a belief structure that I have, and I think most human beings do have this belief structure. And it comes from a line that Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, which is, never to an evil place goes a man who does good. I believe that. I believe the universe is a good place. I believe that the universe is run by mathematical laws of order and harmony. And because of that, and we call those kind of laws in human terms, the laws of justice, that never to an evil place goes a person that does good. That's reassuring. I think that's helpful in terms of how one lives one's life if one has that belief. And I think the evidence points to the veracity of that belief. I'm not saying it's absolutely true, but I think there's a good likelihood that it is. So maybe what we might want to ask is something about the nature of the soul. Is there a soul? Is the human soul continue after death? I think this is a fundamental question that we need to ask. And actually, all the religions of the world say have a doctrine or a teaching of the human soul that survives after death. Even the Buddhists and the Jains, who do have no theistic view that there's a belief in a personal God, they still have a belief in the soul continuing after death. There's a number of people, I think, in the modern secular world who have kind of renounced some religious dogmas, and you might call them atheists and agnostics, that group. And they seem, when they have kind of taken and stepped back from not believing, say, in a personal God or whatever, they've also, in some cases, in a lot of cases, I've found, given up on the whole idea of a soul that continues after life. And I think in some ways it's an error in their thinking, because in some ways they're actually throwing the baby out with the bathwater. They're throwing their own human soul that could very likely extend beyond death with that idea. And with atheists in particular, I have a little bit of a beef in that they think that, you know, we're a kind of a dust to dust kind of thing, that once the body dies, soul dies too. I mean, Stephen Hawking, a great astrophysicist, a theoretical physicist, says that the mind is a lot like a computer, and once we die, we get unplugged and our electrical currents just basically dissipate. I tend to think that they want to say that they're above belief structures, but that's a belief structure too. Honestly, that's a belief structure. So agnostics, on the other hand, I think agnosticism is a good thing to a point, you know, we just don't really know. But if you carry it too far, I think it's an excuse for basically being lazy. Oh, we can't know the absolute truth about this, so why bother? We can always know more. You shouldn't make the absolute the enemy of the relative. We always can know more in terms of relative truth. So I kind of challenge both of them and the belief structures that these groups have. In some ways, I kind of feel like they're two bottles of wine that don't age very well. As we get older and closer to the inevitability of death, that isthmus of our life in form becomes narrower and more barren as we're between the great ocean of formlessness prior to birth and the great ocean of formlessness after the dissolution of the body. I want to share with you my own personal conviction, how I arrived at my own personal conviction that we do have a soul that survives the dissolution of the body. About 40 years ago, I was really into rock climbing, mountain climbing, and I was climbing a peak in the Sierras, a vertical face in the Sierras, and I took a huge fall. And as I was falling, my self-conscious awareness actually left my body and it was still spatially located. It was above and to the right of my falling body. And it was a timeless experience for me, but every time I remember it, it kind of gives me tingles because it seems so present again. It was only like a 4-second fall, but it was super evident to me that my form nature and I had a formless nature that was distinct and separate from my body. And it was kind of a comforting feeling actually too, to know that if one goes into an extreme experience like that, the soul does this little jump out of the body kind of things in preparation for death or extreme pain. So why don't we ask ourselves the question, what might be the nature of the soul? And Edward Bellamy said that there is really only one big problem in the universe, and that is the nature of the soul. Wise beings in many, many traditions have all pointed to 3 main characteristics or facets of the soul. And those are life, light, and love. And they're interchangeable and consubstantial. Life, light, and love can be, they meld into one another and they come in us from our soul nature. I mean, we wouldn't really have, without the breath of life, our forms would have no vitality. And without love, our lives would have really no meaning. Great teachers like the Dalai Lama has described the fundamental essential nature of the mind as being pure light. And Plato talked about that light not only comes into the human eye, but it also emits out of the eye. It radiates out of the eye. And you only have to be around a newborn baby to have that experience of this tremendous light coming out of the human eye. Whenever anyone in ancient Greece had a big question, and the question of how to prepare for death is a big question, they would often leave the city-states that they lived in, like Athens, and they would go up into this mountain called Parnassus. And on this mountain was a temple of Apollo, where they had these priestesses who gave the Delphic oracles. You could ask them a question, they would breathe in these fumes and go through these various rituals that were coming out of the rock, and they would give you an answer that then, which was kind of incoherent sometimes, but then the priest would translate that answer. And so I could very easily see someone going up there and asking, how does one prepare for death? On the columns of the courtyard, as you came into the temple of Apollo, these Doric limestone columns, there were carved 3 of the 3 Delphic axioms. And I think they might give us a clue on how to prepare for death. And the first one, I think most every people have heard of, which is the axiom, know thyself. So one of the ways to really prepare for death is to try as best one can to take one's mind and turn it back on itself, reflect upon its own nature. There's a great Indian sage called Ramana Maharshi who advised, ask the question, who am I, regularly. And that will allow one to go deeper and deeper into one's inner nature and disassociate with our more mortal and temporal nature. The second axiom there on the column is nothing to an excess. In other words, the advice there is to live a life that's balanced, to live a life of temperance, moderation, what the Greeks call sophrosyne. The third axiom, I didn't know this until I just looked it up, is the axiom was surety brings ruin. It's a peculiar axiom, surety brings ruin. But I think that's true about my analogy of us being creatures of the sea. The more we hold our beliefs tightly, so tightly that we aren't letting our minds live a life of questioning, of searching, of deep inquiry, the more we're depriving ourselves of our fundamental nature as self-conscious, self-reflecting human beings. And that, in a sense, kind of brings ruin. Apparently, this disciple of Plotinus, Porphyry, said that when Plotinus died, he said these words. He said, strive to bring back the God in yourself to the God in all. That's a mysterious statement. Strive to bring back the God in yourself to the God of all, in all. But I think in some ways we can do that while we're living. And it was very much exemplified in the life of Vinoba Bobby that we heard about last week from Sarah. He was such a humble man that he was able to almost let the godlike nature in him merge with the godlike nature in others through his powerful life of giving, of trying to do good. So I'd just like to close with this one enigmatic quote that I really love from this Christian mystic, Teilhard de Chardin. And he said, we are not human beings having an occasional spiritual experience. We are spiritual beings having a human experience and hopefully benefiting from that human experience. So there's some thoughts. Just start the conversation with.
Ooh, wonderful. Thank you so much. I think I'm wondering, could there be an entire range of views on what happens after death, and yet some consensus on how we should prepare for it? And that's for everyone as well as Cliff. Yeah. Like, let's say that you're a person who doesn't necessarily believe that they will survive as an individual personal soul. Let's say they believe that it's going to be, they're going to be like a river melding into the great wide ocean. So their personal self was just going to enter the greater self of the universe. Would they have a different way of preparing for death? Or would they have a similar way? It's just a question. And I also want to commend you on that idea that we don't want to be grasping too hard at whatever we believe in, from the standpoint that we can take whatever we believe in right now and be like, this is how far I've gone in my climb up the mountain. And so now that I've gone this far, this allows me to see a little bit farther and see how much more I have yet to understand. And I'm going to climb up that height and I'll be up there. Oh, so it's not like any one place that we're at is not a good place. It's higher than it might have been before. It's just that we have yet further to go. So, any thoughts? Randy?
Yeah, I was just going to, I want to come in, Cliff, on, I thought that was really interesting how you brought the animals of the sea into our perspective. I thought that was great. I have another analogy or metaphor, and if you can imagine, and I may have mentioned this on one of the gems things earlier, that imagine heavy surf crashing into the rocks, okay? And there's this big splash, and whereas each droplet of water once had this connection to the great energy of the ocean, is now separate in that spray, that ocean spray. And for a temporary period, that droplet forgets that it used to be part of the ocean. It goes through its isolation in the spray, and then returns to the energy of the ocean at some point. But in its isolation, it's forgotten this connection. And that's how we each kind of live our lives sometimes, that we identify with the separateness of energy. And once we do return, now we are part of the ocean again. And it's no longer an isolated droplet in the spray.
Yeah, my response to what you're saying, as well as Renee earlier, is that as self-conscious beings, we can expand our consciousness, almost infinitely. So let's get on with it. If we don't have a individual soul that continues after death, but I think we do. Still, well, if we're going to join universal consciousness at death, the ocean, why don't we just start trying to do that now?
Great question. Love it.
Cliff, there are these kind of paradoxes. Like one is that you were named Cliff before you fell off a cliff. That's one paradox. There's the other paradox that what we call life would not be possible without death. Our whole experience of what we call life is completely bound up with death. It's a strange kind of thing when you think about it, is that you couldn't have what you're calling life if you weren't going to die. It's just an odd paradox.
And I think, true, Bob, the more we're willing to be honest about it, that we, death and life are two sides of one another. I mean, it's kind of like we came from a realm that's formless before we were born. We're going back into a realm that's formless. If we really look at those and, in a sense, don't hide from them, it makes our life richer. We're not living in denial all the time. So we're going to live a richer life just by facing that very paradox that you're talking about.
I really love that comment. The surety brings ruin. Actually be something of a way to prepare for death is just, I never thought about that, and it makes so much sense. That was really, really a great comment.
Apparently someone went up to the temple of Delphi and asked the question, who is the wisest person in all of Athens? And the answer they gave was Socrates. And so this person came back down and said, I just asked this question up there to the priestesses, and they said, you are the wisest person in Athens. And he goes, me, I don't know anything. How can I be the wisest person? And he thought about it more and more. He was very aware of how much he didn't know. And so he started to go around Athens and questioning people who thought they knew and undercut their arguments, pissed him off so much they put him on trial and put him to death. But it was interesting. He was wise because he wasn't certain.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There's something so counter to the grasping mind that needs to know and wants to figure these things out. And it doesn't mean that we cop out and we say, we don't know anything, so we're just going to not think about anything and not reflect and all this. So it seems like, I wonder, is there some kind of balance to seeking understanding and mental reflection, but not ever knowing, not ever coming to and maybe that's just the grasping, not ever coming to a tight grasp on the discoveries. The expansion of consciousness doesn't need a grasping, it seems.
Can I add on to your question and ask Mary something? Mary is someone who is very, very deeply devoted to her Catholic faith, and has been, as far as I know, for her entire life. And I am wondering, Mary, if you have had the experience over your lifetime of having an ever deepening understanding of the teachings that you've been given. Like, if it's different now than when you were a younger person in terms of your view of death and how to prepare for it.
I am not afraid of death. I think that's because I hold a view that there is a life after death. It's not going to be anything we can imagine right now, but I do believe that there is something beyond the veil. I also believe that those who have gone before us are right here with us. So many times we can think of a person, and actually I believe that they're right here next to us. You know, our grandparents, our parents, siblings who have gone. I believe that they're very much aware of us and are here to help us. I was listening to Sarah and I thought, oh, we'll find out those answers when we're dead. Because, you know, there's so much that we don't know. There's so much that we can't answer. And because of my belief that Jesus died and was raised from the dead and is in heaven, I believe that resurrection is for all of us. And we all make a choice. We can choose to be good and to join Jesus in heaven eventually, or we can choose the other way, which has, you know, that's just as legitimate as heaven. There is the other place. So I'm going to strive to do as much as I can to get to heaven. And I make mistakes all the time, and I reevaluate, and I say my prayers, and I say, for anybody who I have offended, I am sorry. Please forgive me and help me to do better tomorrow. And they say that tomorrow is a gift. It's called the present. So does that help, or does that give you any? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And in my experience, your efforts to make sure that you live a life that is instantiating this choice that you are making toward the good, toward the light, necessarily affects the way that you interact with every other human being in your life.
I like to think so. I hope so. I know that I make mistakes. Sometimes I say things out of turn, and it might not come back to me until I'm getting ready for bed. I go, oh my goodness, did I really say that? And so it's a constant reevaluating, and how can I do things better? So it never stops. It'll never stop until I'm no longer breathing. Thank you.
And I am also aware that Mary is constantly including all of us in her prayers.
Yes, I do. Every day.
Every single day. Yeah.
I was wondering, as we go through and as we mature, we seem to let go of certain ideas as we mature. You know, we're one of the things you have to let go of is just going with your impulse emotion. So you have to think a little bit about what you do, you know, some reason or mind. You know, when you're 7 or 10 years old, you know, you have to kind of start using your judgment, things like that. So it seemed as if when we go through life, we have a continuity though. Even though we go through these changes of being a kid and then a young adult and midlife and then aging. So in some ways we're really different and expanded, but in another way there's this continuity, and maybe this continuity has to do with the soul, in the sense that the soul is sort of the perceiver, the watcher. And in order to watch, you have to have some light, I suppose, to illuminate what you're watching. Otherwise, how can you see anything? So then the question, though, is that all these are like little deaths. When we give up our childish habits and we regulate ourselves, even though there's this continuity. So we're constantly living and dying all the time because we have to give up certain habits or tendencies, or at least try. So it seems like the more we become self-conscious about that, and the more we can learn by being calm and just trying to perceive what's going on without being too judgmental, but at the same time wanting to improve, and kind of just let go, kind of shedding all these things as we go along. A lot of it's unconscious, really, too. You know, you just kind of shed it somehow as it goes along. But the more conscious one is at that point, then it seems the more conscious one might be of being able to observe and learn, especially as you prepare for death. And possibly that might influence anything that goes on in the afterlife as well. So just some thoughts, and I apologize for getting messed up on the time shift.
We're glad to have you.
Yeah.
So if I'm hearing you, you're sensing a certain continuity from as young as you can remember all the way through growing years, adulthood, more maturing years, with all the changes that you see in the mirror, with all the changes that you perceive in your personality. There's still you who's doing the perceiving. And as you become more aware of this observer that's going through your life, you're wondering if that kind of lifting up of your consciousness into a more aware condition will then have an effect on how you enter into death. Did I get that question?
Yeah, I think that's a good restatement, with just the addition that as you become more aware, then you have to make choices in life. And it's making the choices and letting go and of habits and getting along with people and yielding, and, you know, when to assert, when to yield. And so you start to become actually conscious to some extent of letting go. And you can call these little death as opposed to big death, maybe. All of this kind of may lead to the fact that we might also have that intuition that we're, as Cliff pointed out with his very vivid example, that we're more than who we think we are.
So what do you think, folks? Great question. Kendra, do you have some thoughts there for us? I know you're our staff person.
Yeah, you know, I was just thinking, Maurice, that's really interesting that, and I like thinking of it in that way, little deaths, even though we're alive and we're the same person, but we change so much. And Renee, I think you and I a few weeks ago were having a conversation about this, about how, yes, we're the same person and we're living in this body, even though it is changing as I get older, but you go through so many different life experiences that it's almost like a reincarnation where I can think back on my past life and think, oh, wow, I was a really different person back then. Or that seems almost like a dream to think back on who I was at that point in my life. I forget who it was we were talking about, but it was someone you had a conversation with about how she really felt that she has lived different lives within her one life. And it's just that's what I was thinking of when Maurice said, you know, we have to grow and we have to learn and we have to change. And it's almost like little deaths, so that by the time we're older, we're thinking, oh, we've done this a few times before. And it gets easier to let go and to release that fear. And yeah, it's very interesting. I like that wording, even though it does sound a little more morbid, little deaths as we go through our life. I love that. And one other thing I'll touch on before anyone else, I know we're getting close to the time, but we
have 10 minutes. We're good.
10 minutes. I'm curious. I know it was one of the first things you mentioned, Cliff, about the fears of your grandkids. And it's interesting because about 2 years ago, I took a yoga teacher training, and one of the parts of the training, she walked us through a death meditation. And I had never heard of anything like that before, but when you look it up, there's all kinds, end of life meditation, death meditations, all different scripts. And the whole purpose of it is to guide you through what it would be like to come to the end of your life. Think about all of the people, think about where you are maybe in your career, or, you know, just where you're at in your life, and almost like what regrets would you have, or what fears do you have, or what's holding you back, so that when you come out of the meditation, you maybe have, I don't know, different steps you would want to take, or maybe changes you would make, or a different path you would take. And I thought that was really interesting. I remember coming out of it and so many people were crying, or, you know, just maybe having to reevaluate their whole life. And I was looking around, the only one maybe not in tears, thinking like, oh, I'm pretty accepting of what is and where I'm at in my life. And I think it was because I realized that, just like you said, the fear is the fear. And once you can name it and see it as the emotion, it's much easier to let it go. Just like Ryder realized, okay, we need the sprinklers. I'm going to let that go, and I'll be okay with it. And I'll work through the emotion that I feel in the body. But yeah, if any of you are curious, I mean, you can Google, there's so many different meditations and you can guide yourself through, and I'm sure there's some recordings you could listen to as well. But it's interesting to then take an account of where you're at in your life and see what kind of changes. And it's almost exactly like you said, with that reevaluation of your day at the end of the day. What mistakes did I make? What did I maybe say? What can I improve for tomorrow? But yeah, thank you. It was such a great talk. I almost forgot to spotlight multiple people because I was so engaged, so I wasn't doing my actual job behind the scenes. But yeah, it was really great. Thank you.
Yeah. Randy, before I call on you, I'm going to call on Sharon Tanaka, just from the look in her eyes. We'll need.
I just had a question and wanted a clarification between the jellyfish and the fish, because it seems so similar, or could be intertwined, or vice versa. I was just wondering about that. I love your metaphors or what you use as examples.
Well, as a fish, we can kind of choose where we go, but as a jellyfish, we just kind of float around. So that was kind of what I meant by the jellyfish. They aren't self-directing, you know. They just kind of hang out, and by not having some real belief structure, just living in a world of imagining, basically, they're very vulnerable to being used or manipulated or things like that. But once you develop a belief structure, then you can kind of use it to help yourself be mobile, more self-directing. That's what I meant by the difference between a fish and a jellyfish.
Thank you very much.
Also, I wanted you to clarify clearer agnostic and atheists, because I always thought agnostic had a belief.
I'm sure there are various types of agnostics as well as various types of atheists. I just have trouble with atheists who think that I'm wearing my big boy pants because I don't believe in anything. Well, no, you believe, you have belief structures just like the rest of us. Agnostics are those that basically are admitting, I don't know anything. I don't know. That's what agnosticism means. I don't know. But I think you can't just settle into that for your whole life, because it's just kind of being kind of lazy. I think as human beings, we're supposed to search for the truth. And if agnosticism becomes an excuse to just, sit on the couch and do nothing, then I think it's unfortunate.
Thank you. Randy, I want to get back to you. I saw that hand up.
Yeah, thank you. I actually was a big fan of Brian Weiss. He's a Yale psychologist or psychiatrist who actually did past life hypnotic regressions, and then I also got turned on to Michael Manson, Dr. Manson is a psychologist in, I believe it was Arizona, and he looked at through hypnotic regression the life we have between lives. In other words, that process, and through interviewing these people of their life between lives, he came up with a system that seemed to be a common recurring story, that the soul or the soul groups that we belong to are on this upward moving escalator, and sometimes we will reach down and help somebody from below to come up, and sometimes we'll see somebody from above coming back down the step. And but the idea is learning, gaining wisdom, developing in terms of soul experiences, and that's kind of like what we're supposed to be doing as souls. And I just did want to add on what Maurice had said about, life is kind of like a practice in terms of surrendering or releasing previous identities in that sense. And it's been said that passing from life to death into another life is like taking your clothes off, putting on a new garment. And it's as simple as that. And I think if you can be comfortable with that process, I mean, in nature, it's kind of like we all have fears of the unknown. And once we understand the irrationality of those fears, or why those fears are an emotional expression of what we don't know, when we do know, the fears will go away. And but what is interesting is humankind resists change. And it just seems to be part of human nature. But change is a natural constant. There is always change, and nothing is permanent. Things constantly change. It's how we evolve. It's how it's just nature. So once we accept that and then move into looking forward to change. I mean, I remember when I was in the East Coast, we used to look forward to the next season because, you know, you get kind of tired of the season you're in. And so you're always looking forward. What's coming? What's coming? And then when I came back to Hawaii, it's always summer here. So, you know, we're always looking forward to what's next. And actually that's, I think, a healthier attitude than dreading, oh, what's coming, you know? So I think having a more positive outlook, as I know that, you know, Cliff has that. I think that's the healthiest way to approach any unknown or any change that may be coming.
There's one ancient Greek, Heraclitus, who said that we never step in the same river twice, that nature is constant change. But the one quote that really stuck with me when I was researching this a little bit was the one by Krishna that seems so strong and so obvious to me, that never to an evil place goes a person that does good. It just sounds absolutely true to me. So it seems that the more we try to live a good life to benefit others, the more we can get to the end of our lives and say that we have done something to contribute to the good of humanity or whatever. By trying to live a life of virtue like that, we align ourselves with nature, and we actually feel supported by the nature. And by having that feeling of being supported by the forces of nature, the forces of harmony in nature, then we can also relax. And while we have this inner self-confidence, we can also have self-doubt about our beliefs. We don't have to just squeeze them so hard. So we don't get into that problem of surety, you know, brings ruin. We can be detached, be able to let go, because we know nature's on our side, because we're on the side of humanity and nature.
Is there someone who feels as if they would just well up and like to give a vote of thanks to Cliff this evening? I do. I just really loved the way, Cliff, that you went into this subject with such an open mind and not assuming that anyone was going to come from the same place, that we would all be approaching it from different directions, and looked for some fundamental questions that we could ask of ourselves that would help propel us forward in our understanding. Didn't come to any definitive answers as to what those questions might be, and yet to remind us both at the beginning and at the end that most probably it makes sense to you deep in your soul that no one goes to a bad place who has lived a life of virtue. That probably resonates with us all, and certainly sets for us a pattern as to how we can live our lives going forward. So thank you so much for the very bright outlook and very, very clear talk that led to many, many wonderful comments and questions by our participants. Thank you so much for being here all. Thank you all so much.
Thanks,
Thank
Cliff.
you. Thank you.
Thank you, Cliff. Thank you, Renee.
Yep. Thanks, Cliff. Thanks, Renee.
Aloha.
Aloha.
Uh,